All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive sequence of events that kicked off in 1939 and absolutely transformed global history forever. We're talking about a conflict that pulled in over 70 nations, impacted literally billions of lives, and really set the stage for the geopolitical reality you and I navigate every single day. By zooming in on the sheer, mind-boggling scale of these events, we can finally grasp how our modern world was forged right in the fires of the deadliest conflict in human history.
So, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the spark in 1939, then see how the war engulfed the globe, hit the major turning points, look at the fall of the Axis, and finally, unpack the transformed global history left in its wake. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The spark in 1939 and how the escalation begins.
To really understand this, you have to start by looking at Adolf Hitler's consolidation of power. It laid this incredibly dangerous, aggressive foundation all across Germany. And this momentum, it just built relentlessly until one pivotal date, September 1st, 1939, when German tanks rolled straight across the border into Poland. Now you gotta remember, that invasion wasn't just some isolated border dispute. It was the definitive trigger, the spark. It dragged the great empires of Europe into the fray, plunging the entire continent into immediate, devastating chaos.
Which brings us to Section 2, War Engulfs the Globe, Expanding the Conflict.
So this initial crisis in Europe, it didn't stay contained for long. It morphed and expanded at a terrifying pace. The battleground shifted incredibly fast, from the skies over Britain to the freezing, brutal landscapes of the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa, and eventually all the way across the ocean to Pearl Harbor. The sheer scale of this escalation pushed human and military limits to absolute extremes. During the Blitz, the Royal Air Force showed this incredible, stubborn resilience to survive relentless aerial bombardments. And honestly, before the world could even process that, boom, we see the launch of Operation Barbarossa. We're talking about a devastating ground offensive across a massive front line, all while battling a brutally freezing winter. And then came the absolute shock of a quiet Sunday morning attack on Pearl Harbor.
That surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a total game changer. It forced the United States, this massive industrial juggernaut, completely off the sidelines. This is the exact moment the conflict truly became a world war. By merging the European and Pacific theaters into one single global chessboard, literally every corner of the Earth was suddenly pulled right into the vortex.
All right, Section 3, the major turning points, the real climax of the war.
So, between 1942 and 1944, this seemingly unstoppable Axis war machine finally hit a wall. The turning of the tide essentially rested on three distinct, monumental pillars: Stalingrad, Midway, and D-Day. Now, these battles were radically different from each other, but they were equally decisive. Take Stalingrad. It wasn't just a battle. It was a brutal urban meat grinder, but it completely destroyed the myth of German invincibility and permanently halted their eastward expansion. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Midway was this massive, decisive naval clash. The Allies sank 4 vital Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. That permanently crippled their offensive capabilities in the Pacific.
And following those colossal shifts in momentum, the Allies launched an operation on June 6, 1944, that would ultimately seal the fate of the Axis in Europe, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It was this massive, relentless push that was absolutely required to crack Fortress Europe wide open and kick off the total liberation of the continent.
Moving on to Section 4, the fall of the Axis, the final push.
The climax of the war quickly gave way to a total dual collapse of the Axis powers. First, we see Soviet troops storming the ruined streets of Berlin in the spring of 1945, which was then followed by a dramatic, world-altering conclusion in the Pacific Theater later that exact same summer. But this final collapse carried a staggering, almost unimaginable human cost. The decisive fall of Berlin, which was punctuated by the suicide of Hitler in his bunker, totally removed the original epicenter of the conflict. And over in the Pacific, it took the devastating, unprecedented deployment of atomic bombs to finally force an unconditional surrender from Japan, cementing an absolute end to global hostilities.
But when the dust finally settled, the world was just left to look around at all this unprecedented destruction and ask one really profound question. What lessons did humanity actually learn?
Let's look at Section 5, a transformed global history, the aftermath. You see, the pre-war reality of 1939 was completely dead and buried. There was no going back. Out of the ashes of all that destruction came the creation of the United Nations, a desperate, concerted attempt to enforce global peace. But alongside it came terrifying technological leaps. From the perfection of jet engines to the absolute dawn of nuclear power, these were innovations born strictly out of wartime necessity that civilian life would just permanently inherit.
But the peace they found was incredibly fragile. The end of World War II did not magically bring global harmony. Actually, scratch that. It almost immediately fractured the world into a completely new standoff. Former allies quickly became bitter rivals, literally drawing an iron curtain across the globe and instantly kicking off the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War.
So Japan's surrender didn't just end a war, it permanently rewired our entire geopolitical reality. As we navigate the complex alliances and conflicts of our modern world today, we really have to ask ourselves, have we truly absorbed the lessons from the deadliest conflict in human history? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning.